going to start off. We know we're standing between you and lunch, but so we're going to go quickly but steadily. But we want to give you guys some time to answer questions too. So we are going to explore the political atmosphere of these midterm elections. I'm sure none of you have heard anything about any of the elections going on this year. So we have two of the best here with us today. We have Bill McInturff, who is a partner at Public Opinion Strategies, a Republican polling firm. I've been working with Bill for 7.5 years here at the Chamber. Worked with a couple of the other partners there on other campaigns that I've worked on, and they are truly one of the best in the country. Also, David Wasserman from the Cook Political Report, the best political prognosticators in the country. He is the foremost House election expert in the country. So we are thankful for both of you to join us today. I'm going to start out with some polling because, again, nobody's probably heard any polling this year at all. So Bill, you recently came out with your monthly NBC Wall Street Journal poll that you do along with Peter Hart, a Democratic pollster. And you found some pretty interesting findings there that you've never seen in the midterms before. Can you kind of walk us through sort of the baselines of those?
Well, yeah, thank you, and thanks for your patience before lunch. 70% of voters said they were very interested in voting. That was higher than any single midterm going back to 1994 when I first wrote that question. And importantly, Republicans had a 9-point advantage over Democrats in terms of enthusiasm. That's the biggest margin Republicans have had since their major election win in 2010. As well, we had more than 70% say the country's in the wrong track. That barometer about the country, right direction, wrong track, 70% is when incumbent parties sort of crack. We've had 6 straight tracks over 70%. That's the first in a 30-year history for the NBC poll. And then I think also significantly, we look a lot at something called the Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index. It's national, but in June it dropped to 50 points. That is the lowest measure ever in this country since 1950s when they started. And Jim, they've had 6 straight months under 60. There's only been 3 elections that have had a number under 60 in terms of consumer confidence. They're 1974, Republicans got wiped out. 1980, Jimmy Carter got wiped out. 2008, Obama, Republicans got wiped out. Every time this has happened, we've seen the incumbent party suffer major losses. So environmentally, we're seeing just a really grim set of numbers for the Democratic Party. And modest note, when I was here in 2018, equal candor, it was equally grim for the Republican Party, and I said so.
Right. And the inflation, is that what's affecting the consumer index, the inflation problem?
Yeah, no question. It's cost of living. We do and Dave was kind enough to like the question. We did this question, which is okay, what's the most important issue? Cost of living or abortion? Cost of living, 59%, abortion, 37%. And among the people who picked cost of living, Republicans are 20 points ahead in terms of congressional preference. So I don't at all want to discount the importance of abortion as an emotional issue, but this is an issue in an election that's dominated by economic concerns, and the people picking these economic concerns are voting by 10 or 15 or 20 points Republican. So again, I've been on the other side of this. If you're a Democrat and the top 2 issues are economic and you're losing those issues, that does not go well for the party that's in that position.
Okay. And you're at the same time, you're asking these Democratic statewide candidates to outperform their president by what, 10 points or more, and how does that bode?
I think that's the real issue. We see the president at 41% as an average across these swing states. I've done this a long time. I've also run campaigns for a living. So you could run 5 or 6 points ahead of the president. You can do 8. 8 gets tough. You getting to 9 or 10 and things just crack. People do have some consistency. They don't go in and say, oh, I'm really feeling badly about the environment. I'm only at 41% for the Democratic president, but I'm going to be 8, 9, 10 points higher for that party's nominee. So I think the polling is going to be, I think it's going to be pretty good this cycle. Here's my worry, that there's a lot of seats where you read about Democrats are ahead, Democrats are ahead, Democrats are ahead. But they're ahead because they're at 47%, and they're ahead by 1 or 2 points. 47% when the president's at 41 means, hey, guess what? They're 6 points out of the president. Those last points from 47 to 50, that's really, really hard territory. And so just let's be honest, Republicans do not have a lot of superstar candidates in the Senate. That's true, and that's a factor. But asking a whole set of an entire generation of these Senate candidates to be that far ahead, some of them will make it. I think some of them won't, and I personally believe the Senate's a little closer to being Republican than is sort of the norm in terms of thinking today than Washington, D.C.
Okay. And since we're on polling, just a sidebar, I'm told by my colleagues, I'm the only non-lawyer in ILR, so I'm told by my colleagues that's a legal term. So the sidebar, how is there's been a lot of questions about the polling over the last couple cycles. So how is the process for pollsters today? What difficulties are you facing, and sort of how are you overcoming those challenges?
Well, let me make sure I used to say there's 2 words, hubris.
Although you've been completely accurate on all the polls you've done for us.
That's why I'm still here. There's 2 words, 2 H words, hubris and humble. This is a good time for pollsters to be humble. Let me tell you my own kind of conflict. In the 2020 surveys we did for NBC Wall Street Journal, we said the Democrats were going to win the congressional vote by 3 points, and they did. Well, we said 4. They won by 3. You're right on the race. We were wrong on Trump. We were one of the national polls wrong on Trump. We missed the race for the first time, and it was the worst polling year in 40 years since the Carter-Reagan. Okay, we missed. But my point is, if the poll was wrong, if the weighting was wrong, if the people weren't responding, if all this stuff were true, we wouldn't be right on the congressional preference for the Democrats. So I think that there is something related to Donald Trump. I think people systematically, and we know this, we did a survey on election day of 2020, and 19% of people said, no, I didn't tell anybody I was going to vote for Donald Trump. 7% said I didn't tell anybody I was going to vote for Joe Biden. That's a lot of people. And so I think that these misses have been related to Trump. I feel good about 2022 polling. Personally, I feel good. As I've just said, I'm concerned that the cycle will turn out that because of some polls by other pollsters, it'll be, oh my God, the pollsters missed. And that what we're missing is, no, if you know what you're doing, and analytically, the polls were telling us directionally a lot about where this cycle was headed.
Right. Gotcha. Thanks, Bill. David, you're the House expert. Everyone's talking about the majority of the House flipping. A lot of people are now talking about the Senate possibly flipping, but we'll get to that body in a minute. How do you see things in the House races 6 days out? Kind of set the stage for us on what's happening.
Well, if I were on the Weather Channel and I were playing Jim Cantori, I would say a Category 3 storm is headed Democrats' way in the House. Now, why isn't it a Category 4 or 5? Well, it's because we're looking at a split screen. And in blue states, I think we are looking at a Category 4 or 5 because Democrats are the double incumbents. Voters are holding them responsible for everything they're dissatisfied with in their lives and in the news, whether it's inflation or crime. And so in New York State, where Kathy Hochul is hanging on by maybe 5 or 8 points, that means Lee Zeldin is ahead in all 7 of the competitive congressional districts on Long Island and in upstate New York. In California, where we are seeing strong dissatisfaction with crime and homelessness, Democrats are at risk of losing seats that Joe Biden carried by more than 10 points. I think Katie Porter, one of Democrats' biggest stars there, is at just as much risk as Sean Patrick Maloney, the chair of the DCCC in the Hudson Valley. And then in Oregon and Connecticut and Rhode Island, Democrats have problems. But where Democrats' polling is holding up decently well is actually in red states where abortion bans have been passed or strongly considered. And that's been a more potent issue that's benefited Democrats in states like Kansas. Sharice Davids is narrowly ahead, I think, in that race. Or in Alaska, where Mary Peltola is, I think, the favorite to beat Sarah Palin again in the general election. We're seeing Democrats polling hold up better in Michigan and New Hampshire and in Pennsylvania House races than we are in those really blue states. And so the Democrats have been able to make it a little bit more of a choice than a referendum in those places. Bill mentioned the enthusiasm gap, and the latest poll that he conducted had 78% of Republicans saying they were very enthusiastic, 9 or 10 out of 10s compared to 69% of Democrats. And that is a 9-point gap. But if you go back before Dobbs, that gap was 18 points, 66 to 48. And so Democrats have been able to close the enthusiasm gap a little bit. At the end of the day, Republicans have 3 structural advantages in the House. They don't in the Senate. Redistricting, which I think gives them probably 3 or 4 of the 5 seats they need for control off the bat. They also benefit from retirements on the Democratic side. There are 19 vulnerable Democratic open seats compared to 6 vulnerable Republican open seats. So that is, again, more than enough to flip the majority, which is right now on a knife's edge. And then recruitment. And the fact is, even though Republicans have some turkeys in Senate races, Kevin McCarthy has had a much more disciplined candidate recruitment operation in the House. And he's focused on recruiting candidates that are at least one of the following 3 things: women, minorities, or military veterans. And in fact, 70% of the Republican nominees in the most vulnerable Democratic House seats are at least one of those things. And there are even 3 candidates who are all 3 of those things. And so I think that makes it very hard for Democrats to portray those people as the second coming of Trump. And I think before Tuesday, we're probably going to be revising our estimate for Republicans' House gains upwards from 12 to 25 seats to maybe 15 to 30 seats. But I do think it could be in that high teens or low 20s range.
Great. Sticking with the House, what races should we be watching, or what races will the Republicans be watching on Tuesday night, and which races will the Democrats be watching on Tuesday night to kind of find out how their night's gonna be and how their next day is gonna be? House, Senate, Governor, whatever.
I'll defer to David on some House seats.
Yeah, I'll be at the NBC News decision desk where I've been every year since '08. And the first couple things I'll be watching are Indiana's 1st congressional district, which is a traditionally Democratic blue-collar seat in Gary and Hammond, Indiana. Democrat Frank Mervan, who's a freshman, is up against a black female Republican Air Force veteran named Jennifer Ruth Green. I would expect Mervan to hang on narrowly, but if that seat flips Republican early on election night, then Katie bar the door. And then in Virginia, in the 2nd and 7th districts, I think that'll give us a really good window early on election night, because Elaine Luria is, in my view, the slight underdog against Jen Kiggins, the Republican in Virginia Beach. That ought to be a Republican flip. But if Luria hangs on, then maybe Democrats are doing a bit better than we thought. And then in the 7th district, where Abigail Spanberger is one of Democrats' most talented incumbents, and it was redrawn into a seat that's 75% new to her, and the Republican nominee, Yesli Vega, is a little bit further to the right than Republicans would have probably liked. She's bringing in Ted Cruz to campaign in a district that includes a lot of Prince William County and a lot of federal government employees who remember the shutdown. And so if Republicans win that seat, then that would also be a sign of a really big wave.
Bill, you got any races to add to that?
There's a Connecticut 5 congressional district and what I would say, and I asked David to do this, is I said, because let me talk about the polling thing again. You're starting to watch a lot of Democrat House numbers that say, oh, the Democrat is tied. It's 45-45 or 46-46, or the Democrats ahead by 2 points, 47-46. And my point to David is, you should please just do hey, here's all the districts where the Democrat incumbents are, quote, tied or ahead, but they were at 44-47. And if there's 10, 12 districts of that, I think they'll lose 8 of them. I mean, there'll be 1 or 2 that survive. But when we've been on the other side of this, like 2018 or 2016, if you're a Democrat incumbent and you're, quote, tied or ahead, and you're at 44-47, the president's below 40, boom, you're like not going to make it. And I think, I'm very interested in Connecticut 5 because that's a seat where that's been the polling numbers for the Democrat incumbent. There's an open seat in Rhode Island with Alan Fong. Those are all things that I think we'll look at. The other thing that, for me, the other story is going to be, you think about Oregon, Washington, California. That's as blue as it gets. But buried in those states like California, and David's alluded to this, I'm like shocked, meaning I've been doing some IEs in California, I did them this summer, and the Democratic National Party pulled out of advertising in LA. And I can tell you, having seen these seats in the summer, oh my goodness, if the Democrat Party doesn't think they're advertising to win those seats in mid-October, I think people here in this room and nationally who follow this are going to be very surprised by the net Republican gains in New York, California, Oregon, and Washington. That just in those states, the Republican Party is going to, and its candidates are going to be running much stronger than I would have ever imagined 6 months ago and certainly 2 years ago when you just described those states.
Yeah, and if I could, we've talked a lot about atmospherics, but candidates still do matter a great deal. And in that district in Connecticut that Bill mentioned, the Democratic incumbent, Jahana Hayes, she was on a Zoom call earlier this year where she said that she thought inflation was exaggerated, and she said that Democrats were single-handedly responsible for saving the economy. Well, that has been playing on loop in Republican ads, and so some of these unforced errors that we've seen Democrats and Republicans make are impacting how we see individual races.
Okay. So speaking of interesting candidates and gaffes, and where do you see the Senate being decided? Where's the balance of the Senate going to be decided?
Oh, I don't have anything to say. I think, sorry, but I think the Republicans are going to win Nevada because it's the exact model of everything I've been saying about, because I'm also seeing in our stuff very low engagement by the Latino community and very, very low engagement by 18 to 34-year-olds. If you're in Nevada and you're not doing well with those groups in terms of engagement and interest, you got trouble. So let's say Republicans pick up Nevada.
And that's in the incumbent is Catherine Cortez Masto, and the former Attorney General Adam Laxalt running against her.
Just so I'm not all like happy and sunshine, I've been shocked in Ohio that J.D. Vance is in a very competitive election and not put that away. That's something to look at. But let's assume that. So everyone says Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, those are true in terms of who wins 2 out of 3. Let's all hope to God that Georgia's not going to run off, and certainly if that prayer doesn't work, let's all pray it doesn't decide the U.S. Senate. Ralph Warnock, by the way, is now the candidate in all of U.S. history has spent the eighth candidate spent the most money on TV. The first 7 are all people who ran for president. It's just remarkable how much money is being spent. But I think Arizona is the perfect model for what we're talking about, meaning that I think the race is now a 1 or 2 point race. I think the Senator Kelly, the Democrat, is at 47 or 48. There's an independent in the race. He dropped out, but that's 1 or 2 points. That might be enough to win narrowly. But I do think that Arizona is back to too close to call. And I think Pennsylvania is too close to call. And I will also say, in my humble hubris, when you get to 1 or 2 points, their pollsters should be very, very, very careful trying to tell you they know what's going to happen in a 1 or 2 point race. And then here's the version of how big the night gets. If you wake up and New Hampshire is a point or 2, and they don't call New Hampshire by 10 or 11 because the General Bolduc, the Republican candidate, is close enough. Believe me, if that happened, it means that Republicans are probably going to take the Senate. He doesn't have to win. You can just look at margins to know, like, okay, that, So, for example, in 1994, when we were part of the whole, our firm in 1994 in the Gingrich Revolution, my firm alone elected 27 new Republicans to the House, or helped elect 27 new Republicans. And the point was, at 7:30 at night, Indiana, there were 3 districts, and it wasn't that we were just winning. We were winning with high 50s in open seats, and there was a black woman, Democratic congresswoman, against one of these people who runs spends $10,000, and she was at 54%. All you had to do was look, by 7:30 at night, you started dialing and saying, that's it, of course we're going to win the majority. These margins are unbelievable. So if you do what we do for a living, it isn't win or lose, it's margin. So that's what it makes New Hampshire of interest to me, which is like what you've been doing. I think by New Hampshire, you're going to tell how big was the wave, meaning a very, very good Democrat incumbent senator. How much trouble is she in by 10 or 11 o'clock at night?
Dave, you're nodding your head. Or is that roughly the states that you would have said?
Oh, yeah. And, I would also look, I think we'll get a huge chunk of early vote in Florida. And although there's not really anything competitive there, I'll be watching to see whether Marco Rubio outpaces Donald Trump's margin in certain counties by a decent amount. And that might give some indication.
Okay. Speaking of Donald Trump, without him on the ballot this year, where do his voters go? Do they turn out huge or stay home?
Oh, no troubles. This is why we've been talking about Republican turnout. If you're a Republican, your job approval of Joe Biden is, this is not a joke, it's 5% approve, 91% disapprove, 77% strongly disapprove. Look, we have a lot to worry about in this country, both the scope of potential political violence, all the stuff that we all live every day. I'll start worrying about the country when people stop voting, when they're ticked off because of high wrong track. High wrong track and strong disapproval generates massive turnout. And so I have zero worries about the core Republican coalition turning out in very large numbers. They are really cranked up, and they've been cranked up for now 2 years, and they can't wait to vote. And now, because of all this election security stuff, and lots of them haven't voted yet. But election day voters in some of these key states are voting Republicans say they're going to vote Republican by 25 to 40 points. So that's another thing you got to watch out for, because in Arizona, in Maricopa County, 15 minutes after the polls close, you get all the early votes. But there's a lot of states where they count the people who voted first on election day, and that will look like a massive red wave because you haven't looked at the early vote, which is young, a lot of high black voter turnout in Georgia and North Carolina in the early vote, and the early voters are same thing. Overwhelmingly in a lot of these states, they are voting Democrat by very large margins.
Okay, so we want to leave some time for questions. So I'm gonna do lightning round. Two more questions for each of you. David, who is the surprise Democrat win of the cycle? Who's the surprise Republican loss?
I think we already saw the Democratic surprise of the cycle when Democrats won Alaska, and in doing so, doubled their geographic footprint in the House by 104%. Prior to that, they represented 16% of the nation's land area, and I think she's going to win re-election again. Okay. As far as the Republican surprise of the night, man, I think it could be that they sweep the districts in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. Hispanic majority districts are a big deal this cycle because we've seen Hispanics begin to vote more like the rest of the country. And Republicans have nominated 3 Latina candidates in the 15th, 28th, and 34th districts who could be carrying seats that up until recently Democrats were winning 2-1.
Okay. Bill?
My partners told me to seal my lips. We're in a world where yesterday the Democrats dropped $1 million of advertising in 2 different districts that Biden carried by 20 points. So if I said something, there's plenty of time left. As I said, my surprise will be this. You need to not wake up in a pejorative sense, but when we wake up, and it'll be 3.5 weeks from now, and look at California and Oregon and Washington, and say, oh my God, the Republicans netted 5 districts in the far West Coast. It's just really surprising.
All right, so to close it out here and then go to questions, looking forward to 2024, who's going to be the presidential nominee for each of the parties?
So, okay, we mentioned the Trump voter, but we didn't mention Trump himself. I think he's responsible for taking the Senate, which should be leaning Republican, and making it a pure toss-up right now. If it hadn't been for inserting himself into these primaries and endorsing candidates who are celebrities or personally loyal to him rather than people who would have the broadest general election appeal, then I think Republicans would be winning these races by a couple points in Georgia and in Pennsylvania or in Arizona. But those are dicey at the moment. And if Republicans don't pull through, in the Senate. I think, I don't think it'll affect the Republican base's view of him, but man, I think that kind of weakens him as far as how D.C. Republicans view him. I think looking at the actuarial tables alone, there's a good chance that one or both of Biden and Trump will not be the nominee in 2024. But I look, on the Republican side, I think the single most likely is DeSantis. On the Democratic side, it is really wide open because the next best known names in the party are not people with broad appeal in swing states. And so I'll be curious whether there's a governor who emerges strong from 2022 who is not named Gavin Newsom, who decides to run. And the Republicans I talk to would be most afraid of someone from a purple state like a Gretchen Whitmer or even a Roy Cooper from North Carolina.
Okay. Bill?
Well, very quick primer. Democrat nominating process is proportional vote. So if you get 35% of the vote, you get 35% of the delegates. Lots of Republicans in our process, you win Missouri by a vote, you get all the delegates. We have winner take all by congressional district. In a multi-candidate field, if you get 42%, I did McCain's primary race, and he won the nomination, you start winning winner take all. Donald Trump is a lock at 38 to 42% of the Republican primary vote. So if he runs, if you run 100 times, what happens? If he runs, 85 out of 100, he's the nominee. He has a very formidable base, and if he got indicted on the Mar-a-Lago thing, wouldn't matter. Gets indicted on the baloney case in New York about he didn't disclose how much money he had for that stuff, doesn't matter. He's the nominee. On the Democratic side, there's an old Will Rogers joke. I don't belong to an organized party, I'm a Democrat. If the president didn't run, I have no idea. But if you do what I do for a living, you want to have a chip on the table. A chip on the table would be Wes Moore, the new governor of Maryland. I would look for Senator Warnock if he runs. I would look for who are the black elected officials who, if they don't nominate a black candidate, would be on the ticket. Because I think the Democrats, and especially after what could happen in 2022, they have to have a black candidate on the ticket if it's not the presidential nominee. So I think that's another thing you start looking at, which is who are the players, and Wes Moore in Maryland is going to be very well positioned to be a kind of the next tier national leader in the Democratic Party.
Good, thank you. We have a little bit of time here for questions. We have a microphone in the, there we go. She had it all set up. Thank you.
I have a question, and if you could forecast, maybe assume the Republicans do win the House. What level of discipline do they have to stay focused on the issues that are getting them elected and not squander their majority before the presidential election 2 years later by focusing on more divisive issues that will lose that independent swing vote?
That's a good question, because we were talking before, we were going to talk about the margins, right, of
So
who gets elected.
I'll do this really quickly. If it's less than 10 seats, I'm not sure Kevin McCarthy's a speaker. If it's 10 or 15 seats, I think he has the most miserable job in America. I think at a majority of 20 or 25 seats, I think there's a functional conference that functional stuff will happen. But the people we're electing in a lot of these very safe seats are going to be very difficult, and they're not going to fit the Washington pattern. There's going to be a push to do all sorts of investigations on Hunter Biden, certainly the head of the U.S. Department of Justice. There's going to be all of that stuff, and if it's less than 15 seats, none of that will be controlled. And so for the people in this room, each party is a victim of its own worst instincts, and we're going to see plenty of that on display. As I said, we have Republicans talking about Social Security and Medicare. Like, oh my God, not again. Every time we get a majority, can we just leave it alone? So anyway, you're right to ask the question, and I'm not optimistic about the answer.
Yeah, when you said discipline, I was like, what discipline? But so there are really two Republican parties in the House. I think there's the traditional or governing wing of people who are there to legislate, and they're still, I think, half the conference, but they don't get as much notoriety. And then there's clearly the MAGA Freedom Caucus wing, and then there's kind of a subset of that at the very far right of hostage takers, including Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar and Matt Gaetz and some of the other leading intellectual lights of the Republican side of the aisle. And that dynamic we were talking about earlier, where Republicans are doing well in blue state races, that means, you know what, there are going to be a lot of moderates that come in, because the only House races that Trump cared about were the people who impeached him. He was successful in purging a lot of the remaining moderates in other places. And so I think both wings of the party in the House on the Republican side will grow. And that presents difficulties, because those Republicans in blue states and districts who will be up for re-election in tough races in 2024, they're going to be pulling from one direction on McCarthy, because they've got to answer for every kind of outer space type thing that the people on the farther right end of the spectrum say. So I agree, almost impossible dynamic if it's less than 20 seat gain.
Okay. More questions? Another question?
Speaking of those West Coast blue state Republican potential wins, some of the barstool analysis I've heard is that Democrats or redistricting commissions might have attempted to, whether Democrats are driving and trying to run the table, or redistricting commissions trying to draw real fair seats, is part of the cause of that. And appreciate your thought on that.
Look, Republicans were able to gerrymander far more states than Democrats this cycle, because so many blue states passed anti-gerrymandering reform and set up independent and bipartisan commissions. California, Washington, New Jersey, Virginia, Colorado. If Democrats had free rein to gerrymander those states, they would be able to draw themselves an additional 12 to 15 seats on top of what they have in those places. And so the fact that those places drew neutral or maybe only slightly Democratic-leaning maps, and Republicans were able to pulverize Democrats in Texas and Georgia and Tennessee, and especially Florida, where Governor DeSantis passed a map that will give Republicans 4 more seats there. And then Democrats gerrymander in New York gets struck down by the state's top court. So when you add it all up, yeah, I think the unilateral Democratic disarmament gives Republicans a slight net gain before we even consider the political environment.
One more question.
Regional differences around crime, particularly the West Coast. There's so much talk about homelessness and crime in California, for instance. You see regional differences among issues.
Yeah, the most unpopular governor in the country right now is Kate Brown in Oregon, and Democrats are paying the price for it, both in this crazy 3-way gubernatorial race and in House districts. There's a seat Biden won by 9 points in the Portland suburbs that we just moved to lean Republican because Democrats have stopped spending in it altogether. The Democrat there is a progressive who was endorsed by Elizabeth Warren in the primary. That's not playing well at a time when 82% of Metro Portland voters believe that we need more policing and don't feel safe going into the city. And then in New York, I mentioned unforced errors. Sean Patrick Maloney, the chair of the CCC, he ran for New York Attorney General in 2018 in a crowded Democratic primary, and he was asked in a debate, do you support ending cash bail? And he said, absolutely, I'd make it a top priority. Well, that's been playing on loop in Republicans' ads. And particularly in states where Democrats have passed bail reform laws, it's been double trouble.
Okay. Good. Okay. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for all of the insights. We'll be checking back with you on Wednesday to see how accurate you were. But no, thank you, and thank you, everyone, for. And Harold, we wrapping up with you, or? Okay.
All right.